Good evening. Settle in wherever you are tonight, under a blanket in the quiet after a long day, and let me tell you something true. Something that happened to an entire city that trusted the very air it breathed. For 5 days in the winter of 1952, the people of London could not see their own hands in front of their faces. Buses crawled forward with a man walking ahead of them carrying a flame guiding the driver like a lantern through a cave. Inside their own houses, families lost sight of the far wall. And in hospitals across the city, doctors began quietly running out of beds because the air itself, the ordinary London air that everyone had breathed their whole lives without a second thought, had turned into something that could kill. On the evening of December the 5th, a bus conductor named Arthur finishes his final round for the night and steps down onto a street he has walked 1,000 times. He knows every crack in the pavement, every lamppost, every turn between the depot and his front door. Tonight he cannot find any of it. The fog has come down so thick and so yellow that the street lamp above him is nothing but a dim orange smear, and when he holds his hand out at arm's length, his own fingers disappear before he can count them. He has seen London fog before. Everyone has. It is part of the city's character, something visitors joke about and postcards make light of. But this is different, and he feels it in his chest before he understands it in his mind, a tightness that was not there an hour ago. He presses a handkerchief over his nose and mouth and begins to walk home by memory alone, counting his steps between corners, one hand trailing along a wall he cannot see. Behind him the depot lights vanish into the yellow dark as though the city itself is being erased one street at a time. He makes it home that night. Many did. But in the days that follow, something moves quietly through London that will not be counted or even fully understood for years. It settles into the lungs of the very old and the very young first, into anyone whose chest was already weak, and it does its work without announcement, without warning, in bedrooms and hospital wards across a city that has no idea yet of the scale of what is happening to it. There is something almost impossible to imagine now about a fog you could taste. Long-time Londoners that week would describe it settling on the tongue with a gritty, sulphurous bite, the way a struck match tastes if you get too close. It seeped in through window frames and door gaps that had never let in weather before. It turned white gloves black within a single walk to the shops. Cinemas closed their doors mid-showing because the audience could no longer see the screen through the haze inside the auditorium itself. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a city that had survived war, survived the Blitz, survived rationing and rubble, found itself brought quietly to its knees by something as ordinary and as familiar as its own chimney smoke. What is strange and worth sitting with for a moment is how unremarkable it all seemed at first. London was a city that expected fog. The nickname for it, the pea souper, had been in use for 100 years already. A fond, almost affectionate joke about a city wrapped in its own weather. Nobody in early December of 1952 believed this particular fog would be any different from the hundreds that had rolled through before it. That is in some ways the quietest and strangest part of this story. Nobody rang an alarm, nobody closed the schools. The danger arrived disguised as something completely familiar, something Londoners had learned across generations not to fear at all. Scholars who have studied this event since have come to describe it as one of the deadliest environmental disasters in modern European history, and yet for decades its true scale went almost unrecognized, hidden behind numbers that were quietly, honestly wrong. What actually happened during those 5 days, how a city's own coal fires turned against it, and how long it took anyone to understand the true cost is a story that reaches back 7 centuries before that December evening, and forward into the air that cities all over the world still breathe today. Before we go further into that story, if this is the kind of history you have been looking for, something told slowly and honestly without shouting or shock, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this kind of storytelling reach more people who are looking for exactly this. And I would love to know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what drew you to this particular story. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Because to understand what happened to Arthur, and to the thousands of others walking home through that same yellow dark, you have to go back much further than 1952. You have to go back to a city that built its entire life, its warmth, its industry, its very sense of home around the burning of coal long before anyone understood what that choice would eventually cost. London did not stumble into this disaster by accident. It walked toward it slowly over hundreds of winters, one fire at a time in hearths and factories and railway yards, each one adding its own small breath of smoke to a sky that seemed for centuries large enough to hold it all without consequence. The story of that long, slow build-up and of the particular week when the sky finally proved it was not large enough, after all, is where we go next. London did not choose this fate in a single moment. It arrived at it slowly the way a person arrives at a habit. They no longer noticed through centuries of small, reasonable decision that each made perfect sense on their own. The story begins in a way with a rock that burns. Along parts of the northeastern coast of England, black stone occasionally washed up on the shore, carried there by tides and old seams exposed to the water. Early Londoners called it sea coal, not because it came from beneath the sea itself, though some of it did, but because it arrived by ship hauled down the coast from Newcastle and unloaded onto the docks along the River Thames. Wood had always been the city's fuel of choice, but by the 13th century London's forests were thinning and wood was growing expensive in a way that coal, dirty and difficult as it was, simply was not. So people began to burn it. Blacksmiths burned it first because it produced a fiercer heat than wood ever could. Then brewers, then lime burners and dyers and anyone whose trade needed more fire than the city's remaining timber could reasonably supply. The smell announced itself almost immediately. Coal smoke carries a sharp, sulphurous edge that wood smoke does not, something closer to rotten eggs than to a cosy hearth. And it did not take long for London's residents to notice the difference in the air they were breathing. By the middle of the 13th century, the complaints had reached the royal court itself. Queen Eleanor of Provence is said to have been so troubled by the smoke drifting from coal fires near Nottingham Castle that she cut short her stay there. Entirely unwilling to remain in air she found so foul, whether every detail of that particular account survives from a fully reliable source is something historians still debate the way so much from this period does. But what is not in doubt is that by the 1200s English coal smoke had already become something worth writing down, worth complaining about, worth fleeing. Parliament took the complaint seriously enough to act. In the year 1306, a royal proclamation restricted the burning of sea coal within the city of London, an early and remarkable acknowledgement that the air itself could be regulated, that a government had some responsibility for what its people were breathing. Popular retellings over the centuries have added a darker flourish to this story, claiming that violators faced execution for defying the ban. The historical record does not clearly support that particular detail, and most serious historians treat it as legend rather than fact, though the proclamation itself and the genuine anger behind it were entirely real. What the record does show clearly is that the ban did very little. Coal was too useful, too cheap, and too deeply woven into the trades that depended on it. Within a generation, London's furnaces were burning again and they never really stopped. By the time of the Industrial Revolution, coal was no longer a controversial fuel. It was the fuel, the thing that made the modern city possible at all. Factories multiplied along the Thames, each with its own chimney, each chimney adding its own thin column of smoke to a sky that was slowly, imperceptibly filling in. Railways burned it. Gasworks burned it. and in nearly every home across the city, rich and poor alike, coal fires burned in the hearth because there was, for most of London's history, simply no better alternative for keeping a household warm through an English winter. A writer and diarist named John Evelyn, walking through London in the 1660s, described a city so thickly wrapped in smoke that its churches seemed to wear a perpetual half-mourning, their stonework darkened and pitted by decades of soot settling into the very fabric of the buildings. He wrote an entire pamphlet on the subject, urging the city to move its most polluting industries downwind and plant trees to sweeten the air, and almost nothing came of it. The smoke was simply too useful to give up and too gradual in its harm for anyone to feel the full weight of what it was doing. This is in some ways the quiet human centre of the whole story. Nobody in London across any of these centuries set out to poison their own city. Every fire that was lit for an entirely understandable reason: to warm a child's bedroom, to bake a family's bread, to keep a workshop running through a cold morning so that a craftsman could feed his family. The harm was never intentional. It accumulated instead, fire by fire, decade by decade, in a way that was almost impossible for anyone living through it to notice, because it never arrived as a single dramatic event. It arrived as weather, as atmosphere, as simply the way London's air had always been for as long as anyone could remember, so that each generation inherited a slightly thicker fog than the one before it, and simply assumed that was what the sky over their city had always looked like. By the 1800s, London's fogs had taken on a colour and a character distinct enough to earn their own name. Visitors and residents alike began calling them pea soupers, a wry, almost fond nickname for a fog so thick and so yellow-green that it seemed to have the texture of the very soup it was named after. Writers of the period folded these fogs into their fiction so often that the pea souper became a kind of literary shorthand for London itself, a city perpetually wrapped in mystery and shadow. What is easy to forget now reading those old descriptions is that the fog they were describing so atmospherically was not simply weather, it was smoke. Ordinary household and industrial smoke trapped low over the city by damp English air, thick enough by the 1840s and 50s that London recorded what were even then unusually high numbers of deaths from bronchitis and other respiratory illness during its worst fog weeks. Doctors of the period noted the pattern without fully understanding its cause, the way people often notice a shadow moving across a wall long before they think to look for what is casting it. What makes this history worth sitting with, rather than simply skimming past, is how ordinary all of it felt while it was happening. A pea souper was for most 19th century Londoners a minor annoyance rather than a danger, something that delayed a train or hid a familiar street corner, not something that quietly shortened lives. The evidence connecting fog to death was there in hospital records and burial registers, for anyone who cared to look closely, but the connection was slow enough, spread out enough across a large and busy city that it never gathered, the kind of attention a single dramatic disaster would have demanded. It simply became part of the texture of London life, the way a chronic cough becomes part of a person's identity long before anyone thinks to ask what caused it. By the early years of the 20th century, London had grown into one of the largest cities on earth, and its air had grown along with it, thickened by more chimneys, more factories, more coal burned by more people than any English city had ever needed to warm and power before. And still, somehow the danger remained mostly invisible, folded into weather reports and literary description rather than public health warnings. The city had lived alongside its own smoke for so many centuries that it had, in a very real sense, stopped being able to see it clearly at all. It would take a very particular set of circumstances arriving all at once in a single unlucky winter to finally force that smoke into the centre of the story rather than its familiar place at the edges. There is a strange kind of history that only becomes visible in hindsight when ordinary conditions align in a way nobody could have predicted, turning a familiar background hazard into something the whole world would eventually be forced to reckon with. London's coal smoke had been building toward that alignment for 700 years, one chimney at a time, without anyone ever quite intending it. What was still missing in the years leading up to the middle of the 20th century was the particular set of pressures, some of them born out of a war the city had only just survived, that would finally push all of that accumulated smoke past the point the air itself could bear. Peace, when it finally came to London in the autumn of 1945, did not arrive with the kind of relief the city had spent 6 long years imagining. The bombs had stopped. The blackout curtains came down. But the war had left behind a different kind of siege. Quieter and less visible one, measured in ration books and coal shortages rather than air raid sirens, and it would settle over the city for years after the last German aircraft had gone home. Coal, the very fuel that had warmed London for 7 centuries, had become one of the most contested resources in the entire country. Britain's mines had been worked hard through the war years. Their most experienced miners pulled away into military service, and by the time peace arrived, output had fallen just as national need was climbing. The government faced an impossible arithmetic. The country needed coal to rebuild its shattered factories, to keep its hospitals and schools running, and just as urgently to sell abroad, because Britain's war debts were staggering and coal was one of the few exports valuable enough to help repay them. Every ton sent overseas to earn foreign currency was a ton that did not reach a London hearth that winter. It is a strange thing to sit with all these decades later, that some of the very coal-burning in furnaces across continental Europe during those years may have come from a country that was at the same time quietly rationing warmth to its own citizens. What was left for ordinary households was not the coal Londoners remembered from before the war. The best grades, the cleanest, burning lowest sulphur coal, were reserved for export and for industry, because that coal earned money and kept factories running. What trickled down to household grates instead was often a lower grade, sometimes damp, sometimes mixed with more sulphur and ash than anyone would have tolerated in gentler times. Families burned what they could get, because a cold house in an English winter was its own kind of danger, and few people in 1952 were in any position to be particular about the quality of their coal. There is something almost unbearably human in this detail, a city quite literally poisoning its own air with the only fuel it could afford, not through carelessness, but through a set of circumstances almost entirely outside any individual family's control. The government of the day was not blind to the smoke problem. Reports and committees had studied London's air for years, and there was a general, if unhurried, understanding that the city's fogs were connected to its coal burning in ways that deserved eventual attention. But 1952 was not a year for unhurried attention to secondary problems. The country was still absorbing the shock of a monarch's sudden death that February, still managing continued rationing on staples. Most people had assumed would have ended by now, still rebuilding neighbourhoods that had been reduced to rubble a decade earlier. Clean air legislation existed only in early informal discussion, the kind of idea that everyone agrees is probably a good one, and nobody yet feels the urgency to actually write into law. Historians who study this period generally agree that London's air pollution problem was well documented well before 1952, but there remains genuine scholarly disagreement over exactly how seriously post-war officials weighed the public health risk against the country's desperate economic priorities in those years. The evidence suggests a government stretched thin across a dozen competing emergencies, not one that ignored the danger outright, though the distinction likely offered little comfort to the families who would soon be affected. Beneath all of this sat a detail of atmospheric science that almost nobody in London thought about on an ordinary day, and that would matter enormously in the days ahead. Air, like water, moves according to temperature and pressure, generally rising as it warms and allowing whatever it carries, smoke, moisture, exhaust, to lift and disperse into the wider sky. Under most conditions, this natural circulation carries a city's pollution up and away, thinning it out before it can build to dangerous concentrations at street level. But under certain rare weather patterns, that circulation can reverse or rather freeze in place. A layer of warmer air can settle directly above a layer of colder air, near the ground, forming what meteorologists call a temperature inversion, a kind of atmospheric lid that traps everything beneath it. Smoke that would normally rise and scatter instead has nowhere to go. It simply accumulates hour after hour in the same still column of air that people are breathing. London had experienced inversions before. The pea soupers of the 19th century were themselves often products of exactly this kind of atmospheric trap. Cold, damp English air settling low over the city under a warmer lid, holding centuries of accumulated coal smoke close to the ground for a day or two before the wind eventually returned and swept it away. What set the winter of 1952 apart was not the weather pattern itself, which was familiar enough to London's climate, but its stubbornness. Meteorological records from the period show an anticyclone, a large calm system of high pressure, settling over the region in the final days of November and refusing to move. There was no wind to speak of. The air over London simply sat cold and heavy near the ground, sealed beneath a warmer layer above it for far longer than any inversion the city had experienced in living memory. Every fire lit that week, every hearth and factory chimney and railway engine added its smoke into a bowl of still air with no way out. It is worth pausing here on something easy to miss in hindsight, because it says a great deal about how disasters like this one actually unfold. Nobody woke up on the morning of December the 4th already afraid. The high-pressure system settling over the city registered, if it registered at all, as simply another cold, still grey day, the kind London had endured 1,000 times before. Weather forecasters of the period had neither the instruments nor the historical data to recognise just how dangerous this particular combination of stillness and cold was likely to become. The danger was not hidden in some secret record that officials failed to read. It was hidden in something far more ordinary. The simple human difficulty of recognizing that a familiar pattern repeated one time too many under one set of conditions too extreme can cross a threshold nobody had thought to define in advance. By the last days of November, coal smoke from hundreds of thousands of London chimneys was already accumulating faster than the still air above the city could absorb it. Add to that the smoke pouring from the city's coal-fired power stations, several of which sat directly within the metropolitan area rather than at a safe distance, along with diesel exhaust from buses and the sulphurous fumes of countless small industrial furnaces, and London was, without anyone fully realizing it yet, quietly filling its own lungs. The air was growing thicker by the hour, and the lid above it showed no sign of lifting. What makes this particular week in London's long history with coal so worth understanding is not simply the weather and not simply the post-war coal shortages, but the way those two entirely separate pressures, one atmospheric, one economic and political, arrived in the same city in the same handful of days, each one making the other significantly worse. Better quality coal might have produced less sulphur and less soot even under the same still air. A different weather pattern might have dispersed even low-grade coal smoke before it could accumulate to dangerous levels. Neither condition alone would likely have produced what was about to happen. It was the convergence of both arriving together, unannounced in the first week of December, that would turn an unremarkable cold spell into something London would spend the rest of the century trying to understand. By the evening of December the 4th, the air over the city had already begun to thicken into something heavier than an ordinary evening mist, though almost nobody walking home from work that day thought to name it as anything more than the season's first proper fog. The bowl of still cold air sealed beneath its warm lid had been quietly filling for days, and it was about to receive several million more households' worth of coal smoke as an entire city settled in for another cold night, lit its fires, and without knowing it, took one further step toward a threshold from which there would be no easy way back. Morning in London on December the 5th begins the way countless London mornings had begun before it, with people rising, dressing, lighting the day's first fares, and stepping outside into weather they assume they already understand. Nobody setting out for work that Friday has any reason to expect this particular fog will be different from the hundreds that came before it. That quiet, ordinary beginning is worth holding on to, because it is the last ordinary moment this city will have for the better part of a week. By midday, something in the texture of the fog has already begun to change. Long-time residents, it's people who could describe the difference between a light morning mist and a proper pea souper, without thinking twice, start to notice that this one carries an unfamiliar weight. It is not simply grey. It has taken on a yellowish, almost brownish cast thick enough that street lamps switched on at noon do little more than smear a faint orange glow into the surrounding murk. The smell has sharpened too, a distinct sulphurous bite that catches in the back of the throat, similar to the smell of a struck match, but persistent, hanging in the air, rather than fading after a moment. Visibility, which in an ordinary London fog might drop to perhaps 100 yards, continues falling through the afternoon in a way that unsettles even people who consider themselves entirely unbothered by weather. By evening, in the worst affected parts of the city, some residents report being unable to see their own feet on the pavement below them. There is a detail from this particular day that rarely makes it into the larger, more solemn accounts of the disaster, and it deserves a moment of its own because it says something true about how strange and specific this event actually was. That week happened to coincide with the annual Smithfield Show, a large agricultural exhibition held at Earl's Court where prize cattle were brought in from farms across the country to be judged and displayed. As the fog thickened outside, it began seeping into the exhibition hall itself, filling the air around the animals with the same sulphurous haze settling over the streets. Several of the cattle on display began to show visible distress, and in the days that followed, a number of them died apparently from the same kind of respiratory suffocation that was, though almost nobody realised it yet, beginning to affect London's human population as well. It is a strange, almost surreal image to sit with. Prize livestock collapsing in an exhibition hall, while judges and spectators moved among them, and it stands now as one of the earliest visible warnings of just how dangerous the air outside had become, a warning that very few people at the time knew how to read correctly. Public transportation, so central to how the city actually moved through its days, began to strain under conditions nobody had designed it to handle. Bus drivers, unable to see more than a few feet past their own windshields, slowed to a crawl, and in the worst hit districts, transit workers resorted to walking ahead of their vehicles on foot, carrying handheld flares or torches to guide the driver along a route he could no longer see for himself. Ambulance services, which needed speed more than almost any other part of the city's infrastructure that week, found themselves reduced to walking pace as well, drivers leaning out of open windows to track the curb by touch and sound rather than sight. One has to wonder what it must have felt like to be inside one of those ambulances needing urgent help to arrive, and instead crawling through a darkness that swallowed the whole city whole. Indoors offered less protection than anyone expected. The fog was not simply an outdoor weather event that people could wait out behind closed doors. It seeped through the window frames, under doors, into buildings that had never been designed to keep weather out so aggressively, because London buildings had never needed to. Cinemas across the city reported audiences unable to see the screen through a haze that had drifted in from the street and settled inside the auditorium itself, thick enough that several theatres cancelled screenings partway through rather than continue showing a film nobody could actually watch. Indoor concerts and public gatherings faced similar difficulties. A performance of a well-known opera at Sadler's Wells was reportedly halted when the fog inside the theatre grew so dense that both audience and performers found it difficult to see the stage. A detail that captures better than almost any statistic could just how completely this event dissolved the ordinary boundary between outside and inside, between weather and home. What was actually happening to the air itself at a chemical level is something scientists would spend years working out in careful detail. The coal being burned across London that week, much of it the lower-grade fuel available in the post-war years, released large quantities of sulfur dioxide as it burned an invisible gas that, combined with the moisture already present in the city's characteristically damp air, began forming droplets of dilute sulfuric acid suspended directly in the atmosphere. People were breathing. Alongside this, the smoke carried fine particles of soot and ash, tiny enough to travel deep into the lungs rather than being filtered out by the nose and throat the way larger particles typically are. The evidence gathered by later researchers suggests that Londoners that week were in effect breathing a diluted but genuine form of acid mist, hour after hour, day after day, with no real way to avoid it, since almost every occupied building in the city was in one way or another drawing that same outside air in through its own small daily leaks and openings. Nobody walking through London on the evening of December the 5th had access to any of that chemistry. What they had instead was simple physical discomfort, a tightness in the chest, a persistent cough, eyes that stung and watered no matter how tightly a scarf was wrapped across the face. For most people, this still registered as an unusually severe fog, unpleasant and inconvenient rather than something to be genuinely afraid of. London had, after all, survived far worse in living memory. The Blitz was barely 7 years in the past for most adults walking those streets that week, and a thick fog, however uncomfortable, simply did not carry the same immediate sense of danger as falling bombs. That comparison, reasonable as it seemed at the time, would turn out to be one of the great quiet miscalculations of the entire event, and historians still debate exactly how much earlier warning signs like the cattle at Smithfield might have changed public behaviour had they been more widely known and understood in real time. By nightfall on the 5th, hospitals across the city were beginning to notice something that would only fully reveal itself in the days ahead. A slow but unmistakable increase in patients arriving with breathing difficulties, most of them elderly or very young, or already living with some form of chronic respiratory illness. It was not yet an emergency, not in the eyes of the doctors treating that first wave of admissions. It looked for the moment like an unusually busy night during an unusually bad fog, the kind of thing a city the size of London could reasonably expect to absorb and move past within a day or two the way it always had before. What none of them could have known, yet, standing in those first crowded waiting rooms on the evening of December the 5th, was that the still windless system holding this fog in place above the city showed no sign whatsoever of loosening its grip, and that the coming days would ask a great deal more of London's hospitals and of its people than that first quiet evening had suggested. The fog that settled over London on the 5th of December did not pass in a night the way most of the city's fogs always had. That is the detail that changes everything about what follows. A London pea souper was by long tradition a temporary inconvenience arriving with an evening and lifting again with the next day's wind. This one simply stayed. The anticyclone sitting over the region held its position through the 6th of December and then the 7th, an unmoving weight of high pressure that gave the cold smoke-laden air beneath it nowhere at all to go. Each day that passed without wind meant another full day of chimneys and factories and power stations adding their smoke into a bowl that was quite literally incapable of emptying itself. By the 6th of December, the character of daily life across London had shifted in ways that went well beyond simple inconvenience. Visibility in the worst affected districts, particularly along the industrial stretches of the river and in the lower-lying parts of the East End, had fallen to what witnesses described as effectively nothing, a darkness so complete that some residents reported being unable to see a lit cigarette held at arm's length. Police officers were issued instructions to walk certain patrol routes on foot rather than attempt to drive guiding themselves along building fronts by touch. At Heathrow, flights were grounded entirely, the airfield swallowed into the same yellow murk pressing down on the rest of the city, even river traffic on the Thames. A form of transport that had operated through fog for centuries by relying on horns and careful listening slowed nearly to a stop. Because sound itself seemed to behave strangely in air, this thick, muffled and directionless in a way that made it difficult even for experienced watermen to judge distance and position. There is a particular kind of crime that tends to surface in conditions like these, and London's fog gave it unusually fertile ground. Reports from the period describe a noticeable uptick in opportunistic theft during the worst days of the smog handbag snatching shop window, break-in small thefts carried out by people who understood correctly that a witness standing 10 feet away might genuinely be unable to identify them, or even to see that a crime had taken place at all. 'Tis a strange, almost darkly comic footnote to an otherwise somber story, and yet it says something true and human about how quickly ordinary social order depends on something as simple as the ability to see one another across a street. What was happening inside London's hospitals during these same days tells a very different, much heavier story, one that unfolded quietly enough that almost nobody outside the medical profession fully grasped its scale while it was actually occurring. Admissions for bronchitis, for pneumonia, for the worsening of existing heart and lung conditions climbed steadily through the 6th and 7th of December, filling beds faster than hospitals were accustomed to filling them even during a typical winter illness season. Doctors at the time noted with a kind of professional understatement that reads almost painfully now that the fog seemed to be placing unusual strain on patients with pre-existing respiratory and cardiac conditions, elderly Londoners and those already living with chronic bronchitis, a condition common enough in a coal-burning city that many people simply lived with a persistent cough as an ordinary fact of aging proved especially vulnerable. Infants and very young children whose lungs and airways were smaller and more easily irritated made up another significant portion of the rising admissions. One detail from these days has become among historians of the disaster a kind of quiet, haunting shorthand for just how severe conditions had become without anyone yet using the language of catastrophe to describe them. London's undertakers in the days following the worst of the fog began running short of coffins. Florists across the city reported running out of flowers for funeral arrangements, an ordinary seasonal shortage under most circumstances, but one that, occurring simultaneously across multiple neighbourhoods within the space of a single week, points to something considerably larger than a typical December. These are not the kinds of details that appear in official government statements from the time. They survive instead in the memories of the people who lived through that week, in local newspaper accounts, in the private records of funeral homes suddenly finding themselves stretched further than they had been in years. Why did nobody connect these scattered signs into a single clear picture while it was still happening? The honest answer is that nobody was looking for a single picture in the first place. Each hospital, each undertaker, each parish was simply managing its own unusually difficult week without the citywide data that would later reveal just how many other institutions were quietly experiencing the very same thing at the very same time. This absence of a coordinated citywide view is worth sitting with for a moment because it explains so much about what did and did not happen next. London in 1952 had no centralised system for tracking daily mortality in real time. No shared alarm that could ring out once deaths in one part of the city began climbing alongside deaths in another. Public health reporting moved through weekly registrar summaries compiled by hand city districts, then collated centrally, a process that took time even under ordinary circumstances. A crisis unfolding hour by hour was in a very real sense invisible to the systems designed to notice it, because those systems had never been built to move at the speed the fog itself was moving. Government response during these days remained, by most later accounts, notably measured, even hesitant. Some officials at the time appear to have regarded the fog as a serious but familiar nuisance, uncomfortable and disruptive, but not fundamentally different in kind from the pea soupers London had weathered many times before. Scholars examining the government's internal communications from this period generally agree that no official body fully grasped, while the fog was still ongoing, that a mortality event on a historic scale was already underway. Whether this reflects a genuine absence of available information or a more troubling reluctance to treat an air quality problem with the urgency it deserved, remains a subject of real disagreement among historians, and it is a question this story will return to more directly once the full toll becomes clear. Meanwhile, life in London during these days took on a strange muffled quality that survivors would describe for decades afterward. Schools largely stayed open, though attendance in some areas dropped, as parents kept children home rather than send them out into air that stung the eyes and throat within minutes. Shops remained open, to their windows glowing faintly through the murk like lanterns spaced along an otherwise invisible street. People still went to work, still queued for buses that arrived when they arrived at all hours behind schedule, still carried on with the essential rhythms of daily life, because there was in truth very little else to do. You could not simply stop a city of over 8 million people for a bad fog, not when nobody yet understood how bad this particular fog actually was. For those with breathing difficulties already, the days brought a kind of quiet private struggle that rarely made it into any official record at all. Families cared for elderly relatives at home, watching a familiar cough deepen into something more alarming, uncertain whether the local hospital already strained past its ordinary capacity had room to help. Some made the difficult journey through the fog to seek treatment, guided by the neighbours, by the memory, by the faint outlines of buildings they had passed 1,000 times before. Others simply waited it out at home the way Londoners had always waited out fog, trusting that it would lift the way it always eventually did. Most of the time, across most of London's long history, with fog that trust had been justified. This time, for a significant number of families, it would not be. By the evening of the 7th of December, meteorological records show the anticyclone still holding firm over the region, showing no meaningful sign of the wind shift that would finally be needed to break the stalemate. The smoke and fog had now been accumulating essentially without pause for 3 full days, and the concentration of pollutants in the air over London had climbed to levels that, when later reconstructed by researchers using period measurements from a small number of monitoring stations, would prove to be dramatically higher than anything the city's air had recorded before or has recorded since. The evidence from these instruments remains incomplete by the modern standards, since 1952 era air quality monitoring was limited to a handful of fixed locations, rather than the dense measurement network cities rely on today. But even that partial record was enough to later confirm what hospital admissions had already been quietly suggesting for days. Something was beginning to shift in how a small number of officials and physicians were privately discussing the situation, even if that shift had not yet reached the public in any organized way. Reports were starting to circulate among certain medical circles that mortality figures for the week appeared unusually elevated, though nobody yet had the complete data needed to say with any certainty just how unusual. It is a strange thing to imagine now, a disaster of this scale unfolding almost entirely without a name, without alarm, recognized only in scattered private observations that had not yet been gathered into anything resembling a full picture. That gathering, when it finally happened, would take considerably longer than anyone managing the crisis in real time could have anticipated, and what it eventually revealed would reshape how an entire nation understood the air it had always simply assumed was safe to breathe. The 8th of December arrives as the 4th consecutive day without any real wind over London, and by now something has shifted in how the city understands what it is living through. This is no longer simply an unusually persistent fog. It is beginning to feel to anyone paying close attention like an event with its own weight and shape, though almost nobody yet has the language or the data to describe it that way out loud. Tracking the anticyclone that week later described its behaviour as unusually stubborn even by the standards of British winter weather. A high-pressure system that seemed to settle directly over the Thames Valley and simply refused to budge, holding cold air trapped beneath its warmer ceiling day after day with almost no meaningful movement at all. Wind, when it finally does return to a city gripped by an inversion like this one, does not merely feel refreshing, it becomes, in the most literal sense, the only mechanism capable of ending the crisis, the single force able to lift the trapped layer of smoke and cold air and finally let it disperse into the wider atmosphere. Everything else, every fire extinguished, every factory idled, would have made only a marginal difference against a bowl of air this saturated. Only the wind could truly clear it, and through the 8th of December the wind still refused to come. Conditions in the worst affected parts of the city that day have been described by those who lived through them in terms that still feel almost impossible to fully picture now. Visibility in places like Poplar and other low-lying districts near the Thames dropped to what some accounts describe as less than a yard of darkness so total that pedestrians reported losing their sense of direction entirely within a few dozen steps of leaving their own front door. Unable to locate a familiar corner they had turned 1,000 times before, there is a particular kind of disorientation that comes from losing sight in a place you know intimately, a feeling closer to blindness than to simple bad weather, and it is worth pausing on how deeply strange that must have felt to stand on your own street and be genuinely unable to find your way home. One detail from this stretch of the fog rarely appears in the broader retellings of the disaster, and it offers a small, quietly moving window into how ordinary institutions adapted under conditions nobody had designed them for. At several London hospitals, nursing staff began guiding ambulance crews the final stretch to the building's entrance using nothing more than their own voices, standing at the doors and calling out into the fog so that drivers who had lost sight of the building entirely could at least follow the sound towards safety. It is a small thing, a voice in the dark guiding an ambulance the last few yards home, and yet it captures something true about this entire event that in the absence of any technology capable of cutting through conditions this extreme, it was ultimately human presence and human patience that kept the city's most essential services functioning at all. The strain on those services by the 8th of December had become severe enough that some hospitals began reporting they were operating at or beyond their normal capacity for respiratory admissions. Doctors working through these days later described a pattern that felt in the moment less like a single dramatic crisis and more like an unusually long, unusually bad flu season compressed into a handful of days, a framing that made a certain intuitive sense at the time, but that would prove once the full data was finally gathered to understate what was actually taking place by an enormous margin. This is in a way the quiet tragedy hidden inside how the event was experienced while it was happening. No single moment on the 8th of December looked like a catastrophe. It looked from inside any one hospital, any one street, any one family's front room like an unusually difficult week. The catastrophe only became visible later, once all those unusually difficult weeks across the entire city were finally added together into a single number. Was there a single point during those days when officials could have looked at the evidence in front of them and recognized the true scale of what was happening? Historians examining the government's internal records from this period remain genuinely divided on that question. Some point to scattered internal correspondence suggesting a handful of public health officials privately suspected mortality was running well above normal, well before any formal announcement was made. Others note that the fragmented weekly nature of London's mortality reporting system meant that even officials looking directly for warning signs would have struggled to assemble a clear citywide picture in real time. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete on this point, and it is one of the more contested questions among those who study the disaster closely today. Not because anyone doubts the final toll, but because the question of how quickly it could reasonably have been recognised touches on some uncomfortable territory about institutional responsibility. What is not contested is the physical experience of the fog itself during these final worst days, and one detail in particular has become almost iconic among those who study the event closely. Witnesses across the city described the fog by this point not simply as thick air, but as something closer to a physical substance, a greasy, tarry residue that clung to skin and clothing and left a fine black film on window ledges and doorsteps within hours of being wiped clean. Some Londoners later recalled the peculiar experience of blowing their nose and finding the handkerchief stained black, a detail that speaks more plainly than any statistic to just how much particulate matter a person's body was filtering out of every single breath during those days. Scientists studying preserved samples and period records decades later would confirm that the concentration of soot and sulphurous particles in London's air during this stretch reached levels dramatically higher than anything recorded before or since in the city's history, though the exact peak concentration remains difficult to pin down with total precision, since the handful of monitoring stations operating in 1952 were never designed to capture an event of quite this magnitude. By the evening of the 8th, there were finally the first faint signs of change in the weather pattern that had held the city in its grip for so many days. Meteorological records show pressure beginning ever so slightly to shift the rigid stillness of the anticyclone starting to loosen at its edges for the first time since the system had settled in. Nobody in London could feel this shift yet in any meaningful way. The fog on the ground remained just as thick, just as suffocating, as it had been every day before, but somewhere above the city in patterns invisible to anyone standing in the murk below the conditions that had trapped London's air in place for the better part of a week were finally slowly beginning to break apart. The actual turn when it came arrived with a suddenness that must have felt almost disorienting after so many days of unbroken stillness. On the 9th of December, a shift in wind direction finally began pushing against the stagnant air mass that had settled over the city, and through the course of that day and into the following morning, London's fog began at long last to lift. Witnesses described the change almost in terms of disbelief, streets and buildings gradually re-emerging from the murk as though the city itself were slowly being returned to them after having been taken away. Sunlight pale and thin as it often is in an English December, nonetheless felt to many like something worth remarking on an ordinary sight rendered almost miraculous after 5 days spent inside a world reduced to a few feet of visibility in any direction. There is something worth sitting with in that moment of return because it captures a particular kind of relief that is easy to overlook in retrospect once the full scale of what had happened became known. For the vast majority of Londoners who lived through those 5 days, the fog's lifting felt in the moment like an ending. Plain and simple, the return of ordinary life after an unusually severe stretch of bad weather. Buses resumed their normal routes, shops reopened their doors fully, children returned to school without a parent's hesitation. The city, by every visible measure, appeared to simply pick back up where it had left off before the fog first descended, dusting off its coat and stepping back into the rhythm of an ordinary December. What nobody standing in that returning daylight yet understood was that the fog's departure did not mark the end of the story at all. It marked instead the beginning of a much quieter and much longer reckoning, one that would unfold not in the streets but in registrars' offices and hospital records and government committee rooms over the weeks and months that followed, as officials slowly began the work of counting exactly what those 5 days had actually cost, the number they would eventually arrive at, and the long, uncomfortable process of arriving at it would turn out to be far larger and far more consequential than anyone walking gratefully back out into the December sunlight on that 9th day could possibly have imagined. Relief in London that second week of December did not last very long, and it did not last evenly. For the first day or two after the fog lifted, the mood across the city was something close to gratitude, an almost giddy appreciation for ordinary daylight that had seemed only days earlier, like something the city might never fully get back. But underneath that relief in hospital wards and family homes scattered across every district, something else was quietly continuing, something that had not actually ended when the sky cleared. Doctors treating patients admitted during the worst of the fog noticed in the days that followed its lifting that many of the sickest cases did not simply recover once clean air returned. Lungs already inflamed and irritated by 5 days of acidic particle-laden air do not heal the moment the source of that irritation disappears. For a significant number of patients, especially the elderly, and those with existing heart or lung disease, the fog had done a kind of damage that continued unfolding for days, even weeks after the physical cause had gone. This is one of the quieter, more difficult truths buried inside this entire story, that a disaster people experienced as a single dramatic week did not actually end on a single dramatic day. Its consequences kept arriving one hospital admission at a time well into the weeks that followed, in a pattern that made the event far harder to see clearly while it was still unfolding. Registrars' offices across London, the local bodies responsible for formally recording each death within their district, began noticing something unusual in the days immediately following the fog, though. What exactly they were noticing remained at first difficult to interpret. Weekly mortality figures were the standard tool available at the time, compiled by hand at the district level, before being forwarded to a central statistical office for the whole country. Under ordinary circumstances, this system worked well enough. Death rates in any city fluctuate somewhat from week to week, and a modest rise during a stretch of bad winter weather was neither unusual nor in isolation particularly alarming. What made the week of the fog different was the size of the increase once districts across the city began comparing notes, though that comparison itself took time, moving through the ordinary channels of correspondence and paperwork, rather than any faster or more urgent system. There is a detail from this period that captures better than almost any official record just how quietly this crisis was still unfolding, even as its true scale began to emerge. Undertakers across London, already stretched thin during the fog itself by an unusually heavy week of funerals, found that demand for their services did not ease once the weather cleared. If anything, in the days that followed, several reported their busiest stretch in years, busier even than the fog's worst days, a pattern that reflected the delayed nature of so many fog-related deaths. Cemeteries in some parts of the city began reporting waiting periods for burial plots that stretched considerably longer than usual families, finding themselves told to wait several extra days before a service could even be scheduled, simply because so many other families were at the very same moment arranging the very same thing. Coffin suppliers, already strained during the fog itself, found themselves working to meet demand that continued climbing rather than falling in its immediate aftermath. It is worth pausing here on what this actually meant for the individual families living through it, rather than treating it only as a statistic to be recorded and moved past. Somewhere in London, that second week of December, a woman is arranging her elderly mother's funeral and finding to her quiet frustration that the undertaker she has always used is fully booked for the coming 10 days, an inconvenience that would have seemed unthinkable only 2 weeks earlier. She does not know, cannot know that dozens of other families across the city are at that very same moment encountering the exact same delay, each one experiencing it as a private, isolated difficulty, rather than as a piece of a much larger pattern. This is in many ways the true shape of how this disaster was actually lived through by the people inside it. Not as a single collective catastrophe with a name and a number attached, but as thousands of separate private griefs, each one unaware of how many others were happening in parallel all across the same city in the same handful of days. Doctors at several London hospitals, comparing notes informally among colleagues rather than through any official reporting channel, began to suspect by the middle of December that something more significant than an unusually bad fog had taken place. Some initially wondered whether the city might be experiencing an early or unusually severe influenza outbreak, a natural enough assumption given that respiratory illness of any kind tends to spike during cold winter weeks, and influenza was, in 1952, still a far more familiar explanation for a sudden wave of breathing-related deaths than air pollution was. This detail matters because it shows how genuinely difficult it was even for trained physicians standing closest to the evidence to correctly identify what they were actually witnessing while it was still happening. The idea that ordinary London fog, the same fog Londoners had lived alongside for centuries, could itself be directly responsible for thousands of deaths was in a very real sense not yet part of anyone's available framework for understanding a public health crisis. Scholars who study the medical response during this period generally agree that this initial uncertainty, understandable as it was likely, delayed a fuller public reckoning with the fog's true toll by at least several critical weeks. The Ministry of Health, receiving early fragmentary reports of unusually high mortality from London districts, issued its first public statements on the matter, with what now is in hindsight as considerable caution. Early official estimates offered to the press in the days following the fog placed the number of associated deaths at several thousand, a figure that was even at the time treated by many observers as provisional rather than final. What is worth understanding here is that this initial figure was not, by most historical accounts, a deliberate attempt to minimize the disaster. It reflected instead the genuine limits of the data available in those first weeks, drawn from a reporting system that had never been designed to capture an event of this scale or speed. Whether that initial caution ultimately served the public well by avoiding premature alarm, or poorly by delaying a fuller and more urgent response, remains a question historians continue to weigh differently depending on which part of the response they examine most closely. What almost nobody outside a small circle of statisticians and public health officials appreciated at the time was just how much of the fog's true toll was in effect hiding inside categories that nobody had originally thought to connect to the event at all. A death attributed on a certificate to bronchitis or to heart failure or to pneumonia did not automatically get flagged as fog-related, even when the timing made the connection almost impossible to miss in retrospect. Each death was recorded entirely correctly according to its immediate medical cause, without any mechanism in place to note that an unusual environmental event might have been the underlying trigger behind an unusual clustering of exactly those causes in exactly that window of time. This is one of the quieter, more human tragedies embedded in how this disaster was documented. The people who died were not miscounted through carelessness or indifference. They were counted correctly and separately in a system that had no built-in way of noticing the pattern connecting them until someone went looking for it specifically weeks or months after the fact. There is something worth sitting with in how ordinary life around this hidden toll continued almost undisturbed through the rest of December. Christmas approached in London that year, the way it always did, shop windows filling with seasonal displays, families making plans, children counting down the days, largely unaware that the season's greetings exchanged on doorsteps and in crowded shops were happening against the backdrop of a mortality event that would, once fully understood, come to be recognized as one of the deadliest peacetime disasters in the city's entire history. Newspapers covered the fog itself extensively while it was happening, its disruption to transport, its strangeness, its inconvenience. But the deeper story, the one written, not in daily headlines, but in registrars' ledgers and hospital discharge records, was still in those weeks largely invisible even to the journalists covering the event closely. It's worth asking gently what it says about how a society processes a slow-moving disaster like this one, when the true scale of loss becomes visible only in retrospect, pieced together from records never designed to reveal it quickly. There is no single villain in this part of the story, no clear moment where someone chose to look away. What there is instead is something more universal and more difficult to sit with a system built for ordinary circumstances, encountering something extraordinary and simply not being fast enough or joined up enough to see the full shape of what was happening, until long after the people affected had already been quietly individually buried. By the final days of December, a small number of statisticians within the government's public health apparatus had begun the early careful work of actually comparing that December's weekly mortality figures against the same weeks in previous years, a process that would in time reveal just how extraordinary the gap between expectation and reality had actually been. That work was slow, methodical, and largely unglamorous, the kind of quiet statistical labour that rarely makes it into popular retellings of any historical disaster, and yet it would prove to be the process that finally gave this event its true shape, transforming a scattering of individual griefs and overworked undertakers into something the nation could no longer avoid recognising as a single unified catastrophe. What those statisticians were beginning to uncover in the final weeks of 1952 would take considerably longer to fully confirm than anyone initially expected, and the number they eventually arrived at would differ in ways that still generate genuine scholarly disagreement today from figures that would later be reconstructed using far more sophisticated methods decades after the fact. The story of how London finally came to understand exactly what its own air had done to it, and how long that understanding took to fully take shape, is where the ledgers, the coroners, and the quiet arithmetic of grief take over from here. When the statisticians finally sat down with London's weekly mortality figures for that first week of December, comparing them against the same week in each of the previous several years, the number that emerged from the columns in front of them was not a modest anomaly. It was a number large enough that some of those doing the calculating reportedly checked their own arithmetic more than once before trusting it. Deaths recorded across Greater London. During the week, the fog held the city in its grip came in at roughly 4,000 above what the same week would ordinarily be expected to produce a gap so far outside the normal range of weekly variation that it left very little room for any explanation other than the obvious one sitting in plain sight the entire time. That initial figure of around 4,000 excess deaths became for many years afterward the number most closely associated with the disaster repeated in newspaper retrospectives in early government reports in the first wave of public understanding about what had actually happened that December. It was not a small number by any measure, and even at 4,000 it stood as one of the deadliest single weather-related events in the country's modern history. And yet, as later researchers would eventually demonstrate working with methods and data that simply were not available to anyone compiling figures in the weeks immediately following the fog, even that striking number appears to have significantly understated the true scale of what actually happened. The reason for that undercount lies in something already touched on earlier, the way individual causes of death, bronchitis, pneumonia, heart failure were recorded correctly on each individual certificate without any built-in mechanism for flagging an underlying environmental trigger. But there is a second, subtler reason as well, one that would only become clear decades later. The original 1952 calculations focused almost entirely on the single worst week itself, the period when the fog was visibly present over the city. What that approach missed was the slower, quieter tale of deaths that continued for weeks afterward among people whose lungs and hearts had been damaged during the fog, but who did not actually die until January or even February, once their weakened condition finally gave way. Researchers working with more sophisticated statistical modelling in later decades, examining mortality data stretching across the full winter, rather than just the single worst week, arrived at estimates considerably higher than the original figure, with some reconstructions suggesting the true toll may have reached somewhere close to 12,000 deaths once that longer, quieter aftermath is properly accounted for. It is worth sitting with the size of that gap for a moment between 4,000 and something closer to 12,000, because it says something important about how disasters like this one actually get measured, and how easily the true human cost of a slow, invisible catastrophe can be undercounted by the very systems built to record it. Scholars who study this event today generally agree on the broad shape of that later higher estimate, but the exact number remains a subject of real and ongoing academic debate, since it depends heavily on statistical assumptions about how many of those later winter deaths can fairly be attributed to the fog specifically, rather than to the ordinary hazards of an English winter that would have claimed some number of vulnerable lives regardless. No single figure carved in stone exists here. What exists instead is a range, bounded on one side by the original 1952 count and on the other by the far larger reconstructions that followed, with most serious researchers today treating something in the higher range as the more complete and honest accounting. Alongside the statistical record, a smaller but no less important body of physical evidence began accumulating in the months following the fog, drawn from the careful, unglamorous work of pathologists examining lung tissue from patients who had died during and immediately after the disaster. What they found described in clinical language at the time, but striking even to a layperson reading it now, was lung tissue visibly blackened and inflamed airways coated in a fine sooty residue, and in many cases, clear evidence of acute irritation consistent with exposure to concentrated sulfurous pollutants, rather than any ordinary seasonal infection. This physical evidence mattered enormously because it moved the fog's death toll out of the realm of statistical inference alone, and into something that could be seen directly tissue by tissue, confirming in the most literal way possible what the mortality figures had already begun to suggest. There is a detail from this period of investigation that rarely appears outside more specialized historical accounts, and it offers a genuinely surprising window into just how far-reaching the fog's physical evidence turned out to be. Researchers studying air samples and particulate residue collected during the disaster later noted that some of the pollutants trapped in London's air that week likely originated from sources considerably beyond the city's own chimneys and factories, carried in on air currents from industrial regions elsewhere before becoming trapped beneath the same stagnant high-pressure system holding London's own smoke in place. In other words, the bowl of poisoned air suffocating London that week was not entirely of London's own making, though the overwhelming majority of it certainly was. This detail complicates the story in an interesting way, suggesting that even a city taking full responsibility for its own coal-burning habits might still, under the wrong atmospheric conditions, find itself vulnerable to pollution, arriving from well beyond its own borders, a possibility that would prove to have real relevance for how later governments approached air quality as a genuinely regional rather than purely local problem. The government's own formal response to the growing body of evidence began taking shape in the months following the fog, though not with the immediate urgency that the scale of the disaster might now seem to demand. A committee was eventually convened to investigate the causes of the fog and to consider what measures might prevent a similar event in the future, drawing on testimony from public health officials, meteorologists, and representatives of the coal and industrial sectors whose practices had contributed so directly to what happened. The committee's work was thorough, methodical, and by most historical accounts conducted in good faith, though it also moved at a pace that reflected the ordinary rhythms of government inquiry rather than any sense of emergency. A pace that some later critics would argue was simply too slow given what was already known about the human cost involved. What emerges most clearly from this period of investigation is not a single dramatic revelation, but rather a steady accumulation of evidence from multiple independent directions, statistical, medical, meteorological, all pointing toward the same fundamental conclusion. The fog of 1952 had not been simply a severe weather event that happened to coincide with a bad flu season as some had initially assumed in the confusion of those first weeks. It had been, in the most direct and measurable sense, an act of mass unintentional poisoning carried out not by any single villain or deliberate decision, but by the accumulated ordinary choices of millions of people burning the only fuel they had access to under weather conditions rare and severe enough to turn that ordinary choice lethal. Why did it take so long? One might reasonably wonder for a disaster this large to be fully measured and understood. The honest answer lies less in any individual failure and more in the genuine limits of the tools available at the time. A public health reporting system built for ordinary fluctuations rather than sudden catastrophe, and a scientific understanding of air pollution's precise mechanisms that was still in 1952, considerably less developed than it would become in the decades that followed. The evidence was there almost from the beginning, scattered across hospital wards and undertakers' ledgers and pathology reports. What took time was not the existence of that evidence, but the slow, careful work of gathering it into a single coherent picture large enough for a nation to finally see clearly. That clearer picture, once it finally began to take shape in the months and years after the fog, would not settle every question about the disaster quite as neatly as the growing consensus around it might suggest. Even as the broad medical and statistical evidence pointed firmly in one direction, a quieter, more contested set of questions remained about exactly how the government of the day had understood and responded to what was happening while the fog still hung over the city. Questions that would shape both the public reckoning that followed and the legislation eventually written in response to it. Not everyone who examined the government's handling of the fog in the years immediately following it arrived at the same conclusion about what had actually happened behind closed doors that December. This is where the story becomes less a matter of simple fact and more a matter of genuine, ongoing interpretation, and it is worth walking through carefully because the disagreement itself tells us something true about how institutions behave when confronted with a disaster nobody planned for. The most immediate and most persistent criticism levelled at the government of the day centres on the pace and tone of its public communication, while the fog was actually happening and in the weeks immediately after. Some historians examining internal memoranda and ministry correspondence from the period have argued that certain officials understood considerably earlier than they let on publicly that mortality was climbing to alarming levels and chose a notably cautious, understood public posture rather than raising an alarm that might have prompted more immediate protective action. Evacuation of the most vulnerable, clearer public warnings to stay indoors faster. Mobilization of medical resources. Under this reading, the government's early conservative death toll estimates were not simply a product of the incomplete data, but reflected at least in part a reluctance to fully confront the scale of a crisis that implicated the nation's own post-war coal policy, the very same policy that had only a few years earlier been framed as a necessary sacrifice for the country's economic recovery. Other historians push back firmly against that interpretation, arguing that it reads a level of coordinated caution into the government's response that the actual historical record does not clearly support. Under this more forgiving reading, the fragmented, slow-moving nature of 1952 era, public health reporting was simply inadequate to the task of capturing a fast-moving crisis in real time, regardless of any individual official's intentions, and the early, lower death toll figures reflected a genuine, honest limitation in the available data rather than any deliberate effort to minimize what had happened. Officials working with the tools available to them in December of 1952, this argument holds, could not reasonably have arrived at a more accurate figure any faster than they did, and expecting otherwise applies a modern standard of data collection and crisis response to an era that simply did not have access to either. Both of these positions rest on real evidence, and both have been argued by serious credentialed historians working from the same underlying archival material. What makes this disagreement particularly difficult to fully resolve is a problem common to institutional history more broadly, that surviving written records tend to capture formal decisions and official positions far more completely than they capture private doubt, informal hesitation, or the quiet, unrecorded conversations in which an official might have expressed concern without ever writing that concern down in a document that would later survive for historians to find. It is entirely possible, and indeed likely, that the true picture sits somewhere between these two readings: a government genuinely limited by inadequate data, staffed in part by individuals who privately suspected the situation was worse than official statements suggested, without any of that suspicion rising to the level of a coordinated effort to downplay the crisis. This is admittedly a less satisfying conclusion than either of the two more clearly drawn positions, but it may well be the more historically honest one. There is a related and in some ways even more contested question concerning how much responsibility should fall on the government's post-war coal export policy specifically. Some economic historians have argued that the decision to prioritize coal exports over domestic quality, sending the cleanest, lowest sulfur coal abroad while leaving households to burn a distinctly worse grade, represents a direct and traceable link between a specific policy choice and the severity of the disaster that followed. Under this reading, the fog was not simply an unfortunate confluence of weather and ordinary coal burning, but a foreseeable consequence of a deliberate economic trade-off, one that prioritized the nation's balance of payments over the air quality of its own capital city. Others, examining the same policy landscape, argue that this framing places too much explanatory weight on a single decision within an extraordinarily constrained post-war economic environment. Britain in the years following the war faced genuinely difficult choices across nearly every sector of national life, and coal export policy existed within a much larger web of decisions about debt, repayment, industrial recovery, and international trade obligations that left officials with considerably less room to maneuver than a simple retrospective critique might suggest. Under this view, singling out coal export policy as a primary cause of the disaster risks oversimplifying a much more complicated set of post-war pressures, none of which existed in isolation from the others. What almost all serious historians do agree on, regardless of where they land on these more contested questions, is that the disaster fundamentally changed how both the government and the public understood the relationship between ordinary daily life and public health risk. Before 1952, coal smoke was for most Londoners simply weather, an unpleasant but familiar fact of city life stretching back centuries, something to be endured rather than something requiring active government intervention. After 1952, that framing became considerably harder to sustain, not because any single piece of new scientific knowledge had suddenly emerged, but because the sheer scale of the mortality event, however imperfectly measured in its earliest estimates, made the old passive relationship between city and smoke feel newly uncomfortably dangerous in a way it apparently had not felt before, even though the underlying science had been available in fragments for decades. A parallel debate exists around a smaller but historically significant earlier event that deserves mention here because it complicates any simple narrative in which London's disaster stands as history's first clear warning about industrial air pollution. 4 years before the London fog in the autumn of 1948, a similar for temperature inversion trapped industrial pollution over the small steel and zinc producing town of Donora, Pennsylvania in the United States, killing roughly 20 people directly and sickening thousands more over a period of just a few days. The Donora disaster received considerable attention in American public health circles at the time, and some historians have pointed to it as clear documented proof that the dangers of exactly this kind of pollution-trapping weather event were already known, at least within certain scientific and industrial safety communities well before London's fog occurred. Why then did that earlier? Warning: not more directly inform London's preparedness 4 years later. The honest answer, according to most historians who have examined this question closely, is that public health knowledge in this period travelled between countries and even between different scientific disciplines within the same country considerably more slowly and unevenly than it does today, and there is no clear evidence that British officials responsible for coal and air quality policy in 1952 had meaningfully absorbed the lessons of an American industrial town's disaster from 4 years earlier. Whether a more connected, faster-moving scientific community might have prevented some portion of London's death toll remains one of the more poignant and ultimately unanswerable questions in this entire history. The scientific understanding of exactly how sulfur dioxide and particulate pollution damage the human respiratory system also continued evolving considerably in the years after 1952. And this evolving science would itself become part of the ongoing reassessment of the fog's true toll. Early investigations into the disaster relied on a relatively straightforward model, essentially treating each excess death during the worst week as directly attributable to the fog, without more sophisticated tools for separating fog-related mortality from the ordinary background rate of winter deaths that any large city experiences regardless of air quality. Later researchers working with statistical methods that simply did not exist in 1952 developed considerably more nuanced models capable of accounting for factors like pre-existing seasonal mortality trends, the specific vulnerability profiles of different age groups and the delayed, longer tail of deaths among those whose health had been compromised during the fog but who did not die until weeks or months afterward. These more sophisticated later reconstructions are in large part exactly where those higher estimates of the true death toll originate, estimates considerably above the figure first reported in the immediate aftermath. It's worth pausing on something almost philosophical buried inside this particular scientific evolution because it touches on a question larger than this single disaster. How do you draw a clean line between a death caused by an environmental disaster and a death that would likely have happened soon, regardless given a person's existing frailty or illness? This is not a question with a fully objective, universally agreed answer, even with today's considerably more advanced statistical tools. Different reasonable methodological choices about how to model that boundary produce meaningfully different final death toll estimates, which is precisely why serious researchers today continue to describe the fog's true toll as a range rather than a single fixed number, and why that range has itself shifted somewhat as statistical methods have continued to improve in the decades since. There is one more layer of complication worth including here, because it speaks directly to how thoroughly this disaster reshaped scientific understanding well beyond the borders of its own immediate story. Researchers studying the 1952 fog decades later, armed with atmospheric chemistry knowledge that simply did not exist at the time, identified evidence suggesting that certain particles present in London's air that week may have formed through chemical reactions considerably more complex than the simple combination of coal smoke and natural fog moisture that had long been assumed. Some evidence points towards specific catalytic reactions involving trace metals present in the coal itself, reactions that may have accelerated the formation of the most dangerous acidic particles considerably faster than a purely physical mixing of smoke and moisture would explain on its own. This remains an area of genuine ongoing scientific interest, and the full chemical picture of exactly what made the 1952 fog quite so lethal compared to the many similar but less deadly fogs London experienced both before and after it, is not yet completely stalled among the researchers who study it most closely. What emerges from all of this taken together is not a single tidy story with one clear villain and one clear lesson. However satisfying that kind of story might be to tell, it is instead a genuinely layered history in which government caution, economic necessity, limited scientific understanding, imperfect data systems, and slowly evolving statistical methods all interacted with one another across the years following the disaster, each contributing something to both what actually happened and to how long it took the world to fully understand what had happened. The disagreements among historians who study this event closely are not for the most part disagreements about whether the disaster was real or whether it mattered. They are disagreements about proportion, about how much weight to place on any single thread within a genuinely complicated tapestry of causes and responses. What all of these competing accounts eventually converged on, regardless of how differently individual historians weighed the underlying causes, was a shared recognition that something in Britain's relationship with its own air had to change, and that recognition, however slowly and unevenly it had been arrived at, would soon begin translating into the kind of concrete political action that London's coal smoke had managed to avoid for the better part of 7 centuries. Political change, when it finally came, did not arrive as quickly or as cleanly as the scale of the disaster might now seem to demand, and understanding why requires setting aside any expectation that governments move at the speed of grief. The government-appointed committee tasked with investigating the fog's causes, formally established in the months following the disaster, delivered its findings in the summer of 1953. Roughly 8 months after the fog itself had lifted. This gap, which can feel frustratingly long from a modern vantage point accustomed to faster public accountability, reflected the genuinely careful, methodical pace at which government inquiries of this kind typically operated in the period, gathering testimony from meteorologists, public health officials, industrial representatives and members of the coal trade, weighing competing technical evidence and drafting recommendations meant to withstand scrutiny rather than simply respond quickly to public pressure. The committee's report, when it finally appeared, confirmed in careful official language what independent researchers and physicians had already begun to suspect, that the fog's mortality had been driven overwhelmingly by smoke and sulfur dioxide from coal combustion, concentrated by an unusually persistent temperature inversion, and that domestic coal burning rather than industrial emissions alone bore a very significant share of the responsibility. That last point deserves particular attention because it complicated what might otherwise have been a simpler political story. It would have been considerably easier in some ways for the government to frame the disaster primarily as an industrial problem, something to be solved through factory regulation and power station emissions controls changes that would affect businesses and industries rather than ordinary households. The evidence, however, did not fully support that framing. A substantial portion of the pollutants that filled London's air that week came not from factories or power stations, but from millions of individual household hearths burning coal to heat individual rooms, a pattern of domestic behaviour stretching back, as we have already traced, some 7 centuries into the city's history. Any serious legislative solution would therefore need to address not just industry, but the coal fire burning in nearly every London home, a considerably more delicate and more personal kind of intervention than simply regulating factory chimneys. This is where the political process slowed further, and where a genuine, sometimes contentious debate unfolded over the following years about exactly how far government should reach into people's private hearths and daily habits, coal merchants, understandably concerned about their livelihoods, raised objections to proposals that would restrict the sale of the cheaper, higher sulphur coal that so many households depended on. Some members of Parliament expressed genuine concern about the cost burden that switching to cleaner burning fuels or alternative heating methods might place on working-class families already managing tight post-war budgets. There was, in other words, no simple unanimous rush toward reform, even in the shadow of a disaster whose true toll was by this point becoming increasingly difficult to dispute. Historians examining the parliamentary debates from this period generally describe a process shaped as much by economic anxiety and practical logistics as by any single unified sense of moral urgency, a detail that complicates the tidier version of this story, in which a shocked nation moves swiftly and decisively to protect itself. It took in the end roughly 4 years from the fog itself for legislation to actually pass into law. The Air Act, enacted in the autumn of 1956, represented Britain's first serious nationally coordinated legal response to industrial and domestic air pollution, and it approached the problem with a set of tools that, while modest by later standards, marked a genuine turning point in how the country understood its own relationship to the air above its cities. The Act empowered local authorities to establish what became known as smoke control areas, specific zones within a city or town where only smokeless fuels coal that had been processed to burn with dramatically reduced smoke and sulphur output, or alternative fuels such as gas and electricity, could legally be burned in home hearths. It also introduced new regulations governing industrial chimney heights and emissions, intended to ensure that whatever smoke industry did continue to produce would disperse more effectively rather than settling low over residential neighbourhoods the way it had during the fog. What is worth understanding about this legislation, and what tends to get lost into simpler retellings that treat it as the single decisive fix, is just how gradually it was actually implemented on the ground. Smoke control areas were established district by district, city by city, over a period stretching well into the 1960s and in some parts of the country into the following decade as well. London itself did not become a fully smokeless city overnight. Individual neighbourhoods converted to smokeless fuel requirements in a rolling, staggered process that took years to complete, constrained by practical realities including the cost of converting home heating systems and the limited early availability of smokeless coal in sufficient quantities to meet nationwide demand. Some historians studying this rollout have noted with a certain dry irony that London actually experienced at least one more seriously damaging smog event after the Clean Air Act's passage, a reminder that legislation on paper and cleaner air in practice were for a stretch of years two genuinely different things. There is a smaller, less commonly told detail from this implementation period that offers a useful human scale window into what this transition actually looked like for ordinary families. Government subsidies were made available in many areas to help households cover the cost of converting their coal-burning hearths to smokeless alternatives, but uptake of these subsidies varied considerably by neighbourhood, often tracking closely with existing patterns of wealth and poverty across the city. Wealthier districts tended to convert more quickly, while poorer neighbourhoods, often the very same areas that had suffered some of the fog's worst mortality in 1952, sometimes lagged behind in adopting the cleaner burning alternatives, whether due to cost access or simply the slower pace at which infrastructure changes typically reach less affluent parts of any city. This detail complicates any simple narrative in which the Clean Air Act instantly and evenly protected all Londoners equally. The transition toward cleaner air, like so much of this story, unfolded unevenly, benefiting some neighbourhoods considerably sooner than others. Despite this uneven pace, the cumulative effect of the legislation over the following 2 decades proved genuinely significant. Measurements of smoke and sulfur dioxide concentrations in London's air tracked with increasingly sophisticated monitoring equipment. As the decades progressed, show a clear, sustained downward trend from the late 1950s onward, a pattern that scientists studying the city's air quality history consistently attribute in large part to the Clean Air Act and its gradual district-by-district implementation. By the 1970s, the classic London pea super, the thick yellow sulphurous fog that had defined the city's atmosphere for centuries and inspired countless works of literature, had become a genuinely rare occurrence rather than an expected feature of winter life, a transformation significant enough that an entire generation of Londoners grew up without ever experiencing the kind of fog their grandparents had simply accepted as ordinary weather. It is worth pausing here on the strange quiet magnitude of that change. For 700 years, thick, smoke-laden fog had been simply part of what it meant to live in London, woven so deeply into the city's identity that it had become a beloved literary trope, a nickname and almost affectionate joke. Within the span of a single generation following the Clean Air Act, that defining atmospheric feature of the city largely disappeared not through any single dramatic event, but through the accumulated effect of thousands of individual households switching fuel types, thousands of factory chimneys being modified, and a legal framework unevenly but genuinely reshaping how an entire metropolis heated itself. Few pieces of legislation in modern British history can claim to have so visibly and measurably altered the physical experience of living in a major city. None of this happened without cost, and it would be less than fully honest to present this transition as a simple, uncomplicated triumph. The shift away from cheap high sulphur coal did increase household heating costs for some families during the transition years, at a time when many were still recovering economically from the war. Some economic historians have also noted that the broader, slower shift away from coal as Britain's dominant domestic fuel, a shift the Clean Air Act helped accelerate, contributed to longer-term economic pressures within the country's coal mining regions. Communities that had depended on that same industry for generations, and that would face considerably more difficult transitions of their own in the decades that followed. The relationship between this particular piece of clean air legislation and Britain's much longer, more complicated story of deindustrialisation remains a subject some historians continue to explore, and reasonable scholars weigh that connection differently, depending on which other economic and political factors they consider alongside it. What can be said with considerably more confidence is the direct public health impact of the changes the Clean Air Act eventually produced. Researchers studying London mortality data across the decades following the Act's implementation have documented measurable declines in respiratory illness and related mortality that track closely with the city's improving air quality. A pattern consistent with, though understandably difficult to attribute with perfect statistical precision entirely to, the specific legislative changes set in motion by a disaster that had by that point receded into memory for most ordinary Londoners going about their considerably cleaner daily lives. The fog of 1952, in other words, did not simply claim thousands of lives in the moment. It also, through the slow, unglamorous machinery of legislation and gradual infrastructure change, quietly extended and improved the lives of generations of Londoners who would never personally remember the week that made such changes politically possible in the first place. There remains one more thread of this story still to follow, because London's fog, however significant within its own national context, did not stay a purely local or even purely British story for very long. As word of the disaster and its eventual legislative response spread beyond Britain's borders in the years that followed, it began quietly shaping how other nations and eventually international bodies thought about the relationship between industrial air and public health, a legacy that would ultimately reach considerably further than the boundaries of the city where it first began. Across the Atlantic in the industrial river town of Donora, Pennsylvania, A small memorial now stands to commemorate the 20 lives lost there in 1948, a marker easy to miss unless you already know to look for it, tucked into a community that has largely moved on from the industry that once defined it. It is a modest thing compared to what London eventually built in remembrance of its own disaster, and that difference in scale of memory says something worth sitting with. London's fog killed a number of people many times larger than Denora's, and yet for decades even London's own disaster remained something closer to a footnote in the wider story of industrial history than a fully reckoned with national trauma memorialized more through legislation and statistics than through monuments or public ceremony. That began to change gradually as the 20th century progressed, and as a new generation of environmental researchers working with tools and frameworks that did not exist in 1952 returned to London's fog as a kind of foundational case study, a clearly documented, thoroughly measured example of exactly what concentrated air pollution could do to a human population under the wrong atmospheric conditions. The event became, in the language of public health and environmental science, something close to a textbook reference point cited in academic papers and international policy discussions as clear, hard evidence for arguments that might otherwise have remained abstract or theoretical. When scientists and policymakers in the decades that followed needed to demonstrate concretely that air pollution could kill people by the thousands within a matter of days, London's fog was there thoroughly documented, difficult to dispute, a grim but genuinely useful reference point for a kind of danger that is otherwise remarkably hard to see with the naked eye. This influence reached considerably further than Britain's own borders. In the United States, growing public and scientific awareness of air pollution's dangers, informed partly by both Denora and London, contributed to the political momentum behind the country's own Clean Air Act, passed in 1963 and substantially strengthened in 1970, legislation that would go on to shape American environmental regulation for decades. European nations, watching Britain's experience closely, began developing their own air quality standards and monitoring systems through the 1960s and 70s, often citing London's disaster explicitly in policy discussions as the kind of preventable catastrophe their own new regulations were specifically designed to avoid. It is a strange thing to consider that a genuinely devastating week in one city's history became, through the slow accumulation of policy citations and academic papers, a quiet protective influence extended to millions of people living in cities that had never experienced anything remotely like London's fog themselves. The scientific understanding born from studying this disaster also fed directly into something considerably larger and more lasting: the eventual creation of international air quality guidelines by global public health bodies frameworks that continue in updated form to shape how cities around the world measure and respond to dangerous pollution levels even today. When modern public health organizations establish thresholds for particulate matter or sulfur dioxide concentration considered dangerous to human health, the underlying science tracing back to those thresholds draws at least in part on decades of research that began with pathologists examining blackened lung tissue from London hospitals in the winter of 1952. There is something quietly remarkable in that continuity, a direct scientific and regulatory thread, connecting a specific week in one city's history to protective standards now applied in some form across the entire world. And yet, for all that legacy, it would be a considerable overstatement to suggest that the underlying problem London's fog first revealed so starkly has been fully solved anywhere. Air pollution remains, according to public health organizations that track such things closely, one of the leading environmental contributors to premature death worldwide today, responsible by various careful estimates for millions of deaths globally each year, concentrated disproportionately in rapidly industrializing cities, where the same basic pattern that doomed London in 1952 Concentrated fuel burning combined with unfavorable atmospheric conditions continues to repeat itself in different forms. Cities in parts of South Asia and East Asia have in recent decades experienced their own severe smog events, sometimes visible from space, driven by a broadly similar combination of industrial emissions, vehicle exhaust, and seasonal weather patterns that trap pollutants close to the ground in ways not entirely unlike the temperature inversion that settled over London that December. The specific fuel sources have changed considerably. Coal has given way in many places to vehicle emissions, industrial manufacturing, and in some regions seasonal agricultural burning, but the underlying atmospheric mechanics and the underlying human vulnerability of the very old, the very young, and those already living with respiratory illness remain strikingly, almost eerily consistent with what happened in London 7 decades ago. Is it fair, one might reasonably ask, to draw a direct line between a coal-burning city in 1952 and a traffic-choked metropolis experiencing smog today, separated by so many decades and so many differences in technology and economy? Researchers who study the long history of urban air pollution generally answer that question with a careful yes and no. The specific chemistry differs considerably from case to case, and the political, economic, and technological contexts separating these events are genuinely significant. But the fundamental pattern ordinary human activity, whether heating homes or powering vehicles or running factories releasing pollutants faster than the atmosphere can safely disperse them, remains remarkably constant across time and geography, which is precisely why London's disaster continues to function as such a useful, if sobering, historical touchstone for understanding pollution events happening in entirely different cities today. There is a smaller, quieter thread of this legacy worth including here as well, one that touches less on policy and more on how a city remembers something it once nearly forgot. For many years after the fog, London's own public memory of the disaster remained surprisingly thin, overshadowed in the popular imagination by the more dramatic, more visually documented memories of wartime bombing that had preceded it by less than a decade. It was not until considerably later, as researchers revisited the event with fresh statistical tools and as environmental history became a more established academic field in its own right, that London's fog began receiving the fuller public recognition its scale genuinely warranted. A permanent memorial acknowledging the disaster's victims was not established in the city until many decades after the fog itself, a gap that some historians studying public memory find genuinely puzzling, given how directly measurable the disaster's toll eventually proved to be compared to so many other historical tragedies that received far swifter public commemoration. What lingers perhaps most of all in the long afterlife of this particular week in London's history is a quieter kind of lesson than the more dramatic wartime history the city is more commonly remembered for. This was not a disaster inflicted by an enemy or born from any single dramatic decision. It emerged instead from something almost unbearably ordinary, the simple universal human need to stay warm through a cold winter, repeated across millions of individual hearths, in a city that had spent 7 centuries not quite noticing what all that accumulated warmth was slowly doing to the air above it. There is something genuinely humbling in that, a reminder that the most dangerous patterns are not always the dramatic ones, but sometimes the quiet, familiar ones that have simply been allowed to continue for far too long without anyone stopping to ask what they might eventually cost. As London's air grew steadily cleaner through the decades that followed, and as the fog itself slowly receded from lived experience into historical record, something else was quietly happening. As well, a gradual shift in how the story of that single week came to be told and understood, moving from scattered private grief and cautious government statistics towards something closer to a settled shared piece of the city's own long memory. One final layer still worth sitting with before this particular story finally comes to rest. There is an archive in London unremarkable from the outside that holds something worth returning to before this story finally rests. Among its ordinary boxes of paper filed alongside thousands of other administrative records from the middle of the 20th century sit the original weekly mortality returns from that first week of December in 1952, the same handwritten and typed columns of numbers that a small group of statisticians once bent over in the final weeks of that year, checking and rechecking their own arithmetic because the total seemed at first glance almost too large to be believed. The paper has yellowed, the ink has softened with age, and yet the numbers themselves have not changed at all, sitting exactly where they were first recorded, patient and unremarkable, waiting for anyone who wants to understand what an entire city once breathed without knowing it. What those numbers represent more than anything else is not really a story about fog or about coal or even about the particular failures and limitations of one government's response to an unprecedented crisis. It is a story about how easily the most dangerous things can hide inside the most ordinary ones. Nobody in London across 700 years of burning coal in their hearths ever set out to harm their own city. Every fire was lit for a reason anyone would recognise instantly. To warm a child, to cook a meal, to make a cold English winter bearable for one more night. The danger was never in any single fire. It was in all of them together, accumulating so slowly and so quietly across so many generations that nobody alive at any given moment could have reasonably been expected to see where it was leading. This is in many ways the deepest and most human thread running through everything this story has touched. Arthur the conductor, walking home through that first thickening fog on the evening of December the 5th, was not doing anything unusual. He was simply finishing an ordinary shift on an ordinary winter evening in a city he had known his entire life. He had no way of understanding that the air around him had crossed some invisible threshold that made it, for the first time in his memory, genuinely dangerous to breathe. Neither did the doctors treating that first wave of admissions framing what they saw as simply a difficult week, rather than the beginning of one of the deadliest peacetime disasters their country would ever record. Neither did the officials issuing early cautious estimates, working with data and tools that were never designed to capture something moving this fast, this quietly across an entire metropolis all at once. This was not a story of villains. It was a story of ordinary people doing ordinary things inside a system that had simply never been built to notice danger arriving in such a familiar disguise. And yet out of that same ordinariness something genuinely remarkable eventually grew. It took statisticians willing to sit patiently with columns of numbers until a pattern too large to ignore finally emerged. It took pathologists willing to look closely at damaged lung tissue and describe honestly and clinically what they found there. It took a government, however slowly and imperfectly, willing to eventually translate that evidence into legislation that would reshape how millions of people heated their homes. And it took most quietly of all thousands of individual families across London, adjusting their own daily habits, converting their own hearths, one household at a time, until a city that had spent 7 centuries wrapped in its own smoke finally gradually learned to breathe differently. None of these people knew while they were doing their small part that they were contributing to something that would eventually be studied and cited and referenced by public health officials on the other side of the world, protecting people in cities they would never see facing dangers they would never personally understand. That is perhaps one of history's quieter mercies, that ordinary careful work done without any expectation of lasting significance sometimes ends up mattering considerably more than anyone doing it could have possibly imagined at the time. There is one final piece of evidence worth sitting with before we let this story go, A small thing, easy to overlook, and yet it carries more weight than almost any statistic already shared. Among the records kept from that period, preserved not in any grand government archive but in the quieter files of a London hospital, survives a simple ledger page listing patient admissions for a single day in the second week of December 1952. Most of the names on that page are unremarkable in every way ordinary Londoners admitted for ordinary sounding complaints, difficulty breathing, chest pain, persistent cough. But beside several of those names, in the same steady, careful handwriting used throughout the entire ledger, a nurse or clerk has added a small, almost offhand notation: improved with clean air. 4 words written without any sense of occasion, simply a clinical observation of what had actually helped a particular patient recover. And yet read now, decades later, knowing everything we know about what those 5 days actually cost this city. Those 4 small words carry an entire world of meaning inside them. Clean air. The very thing every single person in that hospital had always simply assumed they had become for one brief and terrible week. Something a person could be sent home to recover into, as though it were medicine, as though it were a treatment rather than simply the most basic condition of being alive in a city. That is where this story finally settles, I think. Not in a number, however carefully reconstructed. Not in a single piece of legislation, however consequential, but in that quiet handwritten phrase, improved with clean air, a small, unremarkable sentence that somehow holds the entire weight of everything London learned that winter, and everything it would spend the following decades trying imperfectly but genuinely to protect. History like this asks something a little different of us than the more familiar stories of wars and empires and famous names. There is no single villain to grieve against here, no clear moment of betrayal, no battle lost or won. There is only a city slowly discovering the true cost of something it had always taken entirely for granted and slowly, imperfectly learning to change. That is a smaller kind of story in some ways, and yet it may also be a truer one, closer to how most of history actually happens. Not in single dramatic moments, but in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small ordinary choices made by people who rarely understood in the moment just how much those choices would eventually matter. Somewhere in London tonight, in a house built long after the fog finally lifted for good, someone is sleeping with a window cracked slightly open, letting in air that carries none of the sulphurous weight it once did, air that generations before could not have trusted the way we now simply assume we can. They will never think about this. There is no reason they should. That in its own quiet way is the truest measure of what changed. The danger became invisible again, not because it returned to hiding the way it did for 700 years before 1952, but because it was finally genuinely addressed carefully enough, thoroughly enough, that an entire city could go back to simply breathing without a second thought. Power across all of history has always been fragile in ways that are easy to forget while it holds. Empires fall, governments change, but there is a different kind of fragility. This story reveals quieter and in some ways more unsettling the fragility of the ordinary conditions we build our entire lives around without ever examining them closely. The air above a great city, the ground beneath its buildings, the simple unquestioned assumption that tomorrow will look very much like today. London learned across one unrepeatable week exactly how thin that assumption can be and how much quiet, patient work it takes to make it solid again once it has been shaken. The fog is gone now, has been gone for a very long time. Photographs from that week still exist, grainy and pale, showing streets swallowed almost entirely into a flat yellow haze, familiar London landmarks reduced to faint suggestions of themselves. They are strange things to look at now, evidence of a world so different from the one that exists in that same city today that it can be genuinely difficult to believe both versions of London are in fact the same place. Somewhere beneath all of it, the coal fires have gone quiet too, The chimneys that once numbered in the hundreds of thousands across the city still stand on many older buildings. Decorative, now unused, a kind of accidental monument nobody intended to build. They rise above rooftops the way they always have, dark against the sky, no longer carrying smoke, simply standing there remembering a version of the city that has already gently passed away. 100 years is a very long time for anything to remain hidden, and yet it happened here slowly enough that no single generation could have caught it ordinary enough, that no single fire could have been blamed. It took a single week, a single unmoving weight of still air to finally make visible what had been building all along. What that week left behind was not despair, it was understanding. Understanding is a slower, quieter kind of gift than rescue. It does not arrive in time to save the people already lost. It arrives instead for everyone who comes after them, changing in small and largely invisible ways the shape of lives that will never know how close they came to a different, harder history. Somewhere tonight, in a house not far from where all of this happened, a window stands open, just a little. The night air moves through it unremarkable, unnoticed, exactly as it should be, and the city sleeps,